a heterotopic space is layered, a bit like Shrek saying, this is an onion, just like an onion. Ogres have layers, but I can't write that in my PhD. I can't be all like, please see, figure 1 of Shrek explaining onions as an explanation for heterotopic spaces.
Hello, students and graduates. Welcome to PhD Lounge, the podcast of late-night interviews with PhD students about their research subjects. I am your host, Luis, and today's session is a special one, as it is the first official late-night interview ever of this podcast. But before I announce the first guest, I want to give a huge thanks to those who have listened to the second episode, where I talked about the history of the PhD degree in regards to its emergence in the Renaissance and Reformation periods by Germanic students who desired to make an academic revolution against the masses of arts and the teaching system imposed at universities since the Middle Ages, until its official consolidation as the highest academic degree in the early 19th century, when Wilhelm von Humboldt founded the University of Berlin, currently known as Humboldt University, and declared the PhD as a subject level of independent and original research, which became and still is the role model at every university in the world. I can tell you that while I was writing the script and recording the episode, I was being aware that everything that comes to revolutionize the world has always a historical background. But I was never expecting that the foundation of the PhD would take 4 centuries to be acknowledged by the academic community as top degree at university after an intense struggle back and forth between Masters of Arts and Doctors of Philosophy. After all, we could say that it was worth it, as it has changed the framework of academia until today. Because the PhD is the very first step for young researchers to demonstrate their potential as independent investigators when researching a range of topics in different subjects through different methodologies that will contribute and provide new knowledge for any student, graduate, and lecturer. Moving now to today's interview, the first guest ever to be interviewed at PhD Lounge is a third-year PhD student in history, researching a topic which might be interesting for you, as it is about disability in Britain during the 19th century. She is based at Swansea University in Wales. Let's give a warm welcome to Felicity McKee. Felicity, welcome. Thank you for being the first guest at PhD Lounge podcast. Personally, it is a great honor to have you, and also for you as well to be the first one to volunteer to not only sponsor the PhD podcast, but also share your research, which is actually good. The title of the topic is quite suggestive.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I am so excited for the opportunity to really share my research and bring it to a wider audience because it is so important. So 1 in 5 20-year-olds today will be disabled by the time they reach 60. And so disability history is everybody's history because the disabled community is a community that anyone can join at any point. And so it's really important that disability history as a whole is taught and that people are aware of it because it can have real world impact, and it is so important for people to see depictions and representations of themselves across time.
Wow, it's a great introduction in terms of what you're doing the research. Well, I can say that the first question is already answered, but could you tell us a little bit more about yourself in terms of background and also other thoughts about what the PhD research is about?
Yes, so I came into the PhD kind of from a different approach. Initially, I was doing diagnostic radiography, which is very different from history. But my health was such that I ended up leaving and I did art for a while, which I used to explore health-related topics. This then led to anthropology, which I did at Queen's. So I got my BA there and I focused in on medical anthropology. I did my master's in public health. And now I'm doing disability history for my PhD. And my hope is to sort of maybe go into medical anthropology or medical history and things like this. Healthcare, I think, as a topic is something that's very close to my heart, but also because it has been joked that I am a professional patient and I wear both hats because as a disabled researcher who has chronic illnesses, I'm in and out of hospital a lot. And I think that's kind of what really got me very interested in doing that research, because I was talking to staff on the ground, and this led to my dissertation for my undergrad and my dissertation for my master's, really getting in there and seeing policy and the impact both for staff, patients and the public. And I think when we look at history, we can see how the present has occurred, how we have arrived at this point in time by exploring the past, and we can learn from the past, learn from those mistakes, and really implement them into current public policy and going into the future. So I think it allows me to have this kind of broad, overarching approach to it. But I do know when I went to do my master's in public health, I got an email back and they were like, "Are you sure? Because you're a humanities student. There's statistics in this." And ironically, I had self-taught SPSS to myself at my undergraduate because I wanted to do stats as part of my research. I was doing mixed method and I had over 800 responses to my survey that went out. So it's kind of a snowball effect. One thing led to another, and now I'm doing history at Swansea.
Well, sounds like that you have been in a mix of subjects and everything, trying to conjugate everything into one thing that really approaches your heart in terms of health, disability, helping the other, which is so important even nowadays, that there are plenty of people having these disabilities that need the help of others. As we can see also, for example, what's happening at the Paralympics, which is a great example of sportsmanship and demonstration of care for the disabled ones. But the disabled people, they still have the heart, they still have the soul to pursue what they want. We can say to them that disability is just like an obstacle for them that in terms of overpass, don't you think?
Yes, I think disability as a term sometimes gets a very negative approach. So I recently had someone, when I said I was doing my research on disability, suggest that maybe I should change the word to challenged or challenges. So I do think when we're looking at sort of disabled people, there is a lot of ableism in the world, and so when we talk about hurdles, I focus on the social model of disability, in that I, as the disabled person, the problem isn't with me, the problem is a societal systematic issue. So for example, a very simple example of this would be I'm an ambulatory wheelchair user, and so sometimes if I'm out and about, there aren't ramps to get into places. So that building then is inaccessible. It's not inaccessible because I am disabled. It's inaccessible because society itself hasn't really thought about disability or factored us in. And that really leads into my research, because I look at ideas of visibility and how visible disability is and conditions of visibility. So partial visibility, hypervisibility and invisibility. And one of the things that I've been looking at is the idea of the performance of disability and the idea of people looking and the gaze. And I think a really modern example of this, as you touched on with the Paralympics, is they currently have a slogan for this set of Paralympics, and it's "rude not to stare" is what they're saying, which does sound a bit like Channel 4 missed the mark quite horribly. The intent there being to repurpose the idea of staring at disabled people, but the problem being that when they say it's rude not to stare, it does imply that staring is inherently a good thing. And there's a difference between staring and watching, because we watch the Olympics, but the implication being that we should stare at those doing the Paralympics. Whereas these are just people doing amazing sports and are amazing athletes, just like people in the Olympics. And yet, sometimes the narrative around it is different. The television coverage is different. How society approaches it is very different. And we do see this kind of throughout history and how disabled people have navigated and how they've dealt with these elements of visibility. So an example would be you have hidden disabilities and you have disabilities that aren't hidden. And hidden itself, even as a term, is controversial for some because hidden can imply that there's something worth hiding. So some people prefer to use invisible, some people use hidden. There is a hidden disability scheme with the sunflower lanyard, which is quite popular. But even then, some people don't like the idea of disabled people then being more visibly marked with a lanyard. Although for me, I do wear the lanyard and I find it very helpful for opening doors in terms of accessibility. But these conditions of visibility and issues around how visible you are available in the present, but we also see them in the past and how disabled people have been talked about and how visible they have been and how they've sort of navigated and negotiated this sometimes to their benefit. And it's just, I personally find it really fascinating, both the idea of being visible and invisible socially, but sometimes we see it structurally in the spaces in which disabled people are in.
Well, sounds really interesting, and also given the fact, going back of that slogan that I've also seen, it's kind of an aggressive marketing purposes, just to forcefully to people to, in this case, stare instead of watching. That also creates this effect on online streaming. So as for example, I was watching a table tennis match, and it was really difficult to find the correct stream. Where I usually go, and managed to find that one American channel called Channel 4 had the humility, or to say the grace, to broadcast that table tennis match, and for me it was fantastic to see. So in a short period of time, because I was watching late night and I was really tired, came out from work, and I just wanted to watch it just to relax. But seeing the effort of the disabled people, and once again to surpass that negative connotation that on the societal perspective they put into, just to, I don't know, maybe feel sorry for them, but that's not the case. And also basing on the past, which also fixes our current days when we perceive what is the meaning of disability to some extent.
Yeah, disability is one of those things that, like, some people will say, I've had people say to me if they see me in the wheelchair, I don't see the wheelchair, as if the wheelchair is itself fundamentally invisible. But the thing is, the wheelchair and being disabled is a fundamental part of who I am. And so if you don't see the wheelchair, you don't think about putting a ramp on your building. So therefore, you make me invisible. You make me as an entire person invisible because you're not considering the overall picture. So like my walking stick or my rollator, they are an extension of myself. So you're not seeing maybe 50% of me present in front of you. And so disability as a term is just, it's massively fascinating because in the 19th century, this is kind of when ideas about norm and average and normative really started to occur. And language is one of the things as well that changes. So a term that I see an awful lot in my research is invalid. And if you really think about the word, it's invalid. But disabled people aren't invalid. We're very valid. But if I was to sit there and go, this is a term isn't appropriate, I take away from disabled people in the 19th century who used that term and really identified with it. So when we talk about disability as an identity and a fundamental part of who we are, many people in the 19th century were identifying with language that we wouldn't use today. And I try to be very mindful of this, especially when I'm trying to bring my research to a wider audience, because language does change and does develop. And again, it goes back to the idea of visibility and invisibility. If I take that out of my research and go, I can't use the language that these people themselves were using, I'm taking away some part of who they were and making that invisible and ignoring it within the research. And so like visibility as a topic, it comes up again and again. And once you start looking for it, it's absolutely everywhere.
Seeing also during the research I was conducting and seeing those negative connotations, that one that you said, but I have also looking for other ones that sometimes they also use such as idiot or lunatics, terms that were used on the 19th century as a type of segregation disability, just to some sort of eradicate the disabled ones, just ignoring them and calling those adjectives, those heavy and negative adjectives, which created some negative response in the 19th century as we see today. It's just so negative in that aspect.
Yeah, language does change. I think a lot of terminology that you've used there, some of those could have been they were medical diagnostic terms that were used. And so some people did identify with them, but they do also come along with their own stigma and assumptions at the time. So an example of an illness that sort of changed across the 19th century was tuberculosis. So when we think about the start of the century, you've got your pale skin, blood red lips, sort of thin waist. It's seen as a creative illness, only the good die young. And at the end of the century, when we've got more understanding of germ theory and how it's contagious, it really changes the perspective of how the disease is looked at. So the actual word, the diagnostic criteria necessarily hasn't changed, but how the illness is seen has changed. And so a lot of language that was used in the 19th century has changed, whereas in the modern day, we wouldn't accept this language. It's not acceptable to use about people. It's considered quite ableist. And then we also look in the past where people are feeling an identity and association with this. And obviously this does vary because some people really didn't quite like the assumptions that would come with certain illnesses that were then associated with them, because the idea of illnesses and identity really comes around in this. So if you have tuberculosis, there's an assumption that you're creative. And this is an idea about who you are as a person. And so this idea of identity that we have currently does have a lot of roots in the 19th century. And I think this is why it's really important when we think about how we are in the present, that we also look back to kind of see how we came to be where we are right now, because it can give us an understanding potentially of the roadmap going forward, where we'll be in the future.
Exactly. Well, it is also evident that the 19th century was that all begins to say like that industrial revolution and creation of forced labor, but also creation of a syndicate and also different infrastructures for disabled people, like asylums and other institutions, where nowadays the term, as they say, psychiatrist, in the past was alienist. Do you have any thought about why they would use alienist in that certain extent?
I've not really many thoughts in regards to sort of the idea of alienist. For me, it's more that the 19th century is kind of a time when we see the medical profession really becoming what we see today. So you've got the British Medical Association and things like the Lancet appearing. And so alienist and sort of like pharmacist and medical doctor and all these different branches of sort of medicine or words associated with medicine were sort of going around everywhere. And so if you went to see someone who said that they were a doctor, they may not actually be a doctor. And so this is kind of why they sort of tried to amalgamate everything so that there was sort of this core expectation that the person you went to see who said they were a doctor had a specific set of training. Now, this isn't to say that some people didn't sort of cheat through the exams. There are records of people sort of navigating the system to sneak around it. But alienist and other terms, these are all basically a modern doctor is what we've got. So you had people surgeons, you had the pharmacists, everybody just sort of becomes this one subsection, although obviously pharmacists are pharmacists, they're different. But when we think of alienist, what you're really thinking is probably sort of an early version of psychiatry, although there were medical doctors doing psychiatry, and the study of the mind is a really fascinating area, especially because like epilepsy was considered sort of a mental illness, and there was a lot of research in and around that. And so in some of the asylums, we're seeing accounts of people who potentially today, obviously it's difficult to sort of retroactively diagnose people, and it's very questionable, but people would quite rightly assume that some of the patients who are in there, we would say would have maybe had dementia or epilepsy and other different things. But again, I can't specifically go, that person definitively has this diagnosis. And obviously I'm not a medical professional, but you can kind of look and sort of see how some of the science to where we are now really started to take shape. And I mean, if you talk to any historian, they'll tell you that their century is the century where everything happened. But I do think the 19th century is one of the really big corners of sort of how we got to be where we are now. A lot of the stuff that's happening now, we can link back to there. And one of the things that I found really fascinating was when I was looking at sort of like rule books or information about the asylums, was that an awful lot of the things that were in there wouldn't be out of place in a modern mental health hospital, which is kind of sad in a way because it tells us that we haven't come as far as we maybe think we have. And again, when we look at like the 1834 Poor Law and workhouses and sort of this idea of the benefit system being that it's to encourage you to work by basically making seeking support or assistance really difficult or associated with certain stigmatizing things. It does kind of link to where we are now with how the benefit system currently stands, and this idea that, you know, it's meant to encourage you to work by paying you very little to live off. And so there's just so many parallels between the 19th century and now that are absolutely fascinating. And it's such a rich time period because things really do change across that 100-year span. Like, it's completely unrecognizable at the end of the 19th century from how it was at the start.
Yes, from what I've read, I've seen that asylums, those kind of hospitals for professional medics, I think were rather to be used as research experiments rather than helping the disabled people.
So there are some doctors who are doing sort of research within these spaces. There was a whole thing about phonology and the idea of the shape of your head, which is quite debunked. And some people took photographs of patients because there could be like the idea of like the criminal face or like the face of a particular illness as if that could predict things. And so there has been research, but like at the same time, asylums in and of themselves are not necessarily the big scary asylum that we sort of see or the grim imagery. There are accounts of not good things happening. And I think depends a lot on how much money you have as to which asylum you're going into and how good it is. But when we think of an asylum, and again, this goes to the idea of sort of invisibility and visibility, people think of like this big space, this building that once you go in, you're never seen again. And actually, there's a lot of permeability between the spaces. So people would go out and they would work and they would come back into the asylum, and there's letters permeating and it's very porous. So it's not as invisible as people think. People don't go in and become invisible. They're also very visible in the fact that asylums, very visible within the landscape, but also the people are going in and out. They have links into the communities. There's this partial visibility. And it is like literally when I say visibility as an idea comes up absolutely everywhere. If you're thinking about it, like with the sick room, I've looked at the sick room as a space in which people are behind four walls. And so theoretically, they're invisible, but they're really hyper visible because one of the things in some of the books suggests that on the floor where the sick room is, you remove all the carpet. So when you get to the top of the stairs, there's no carpet. So it becomes hyper visible. You can see that something's happening. You're entering into a sick space. And so there is this hyper visibility about the idea of the sick room being there. But again, I mean, that's a sick room in a space where someone has the money to have a set room for being sick in. For many working class people, they just don't have that space. And so they repurpose spaces. It's like a kitchen could become a sick room. I was in a conference recently and someone asked, like, could the street become a sick room? And like, theoretically, any space can become a sick room. But it's this idea of how visible that space is as a sick room, but also this idea of permeability, because it's quite liminal, because the room that becomes a sick room is any other room. It could be a bedroom before it was a sick room. And one of the images that I've used an awful lot when I'm presenting is there's this person in a bed. So it's clearly a bedroom. It's become their sick room, but it's also a gaming room because the staff who are there to help this person are playing cards. So the space becomes many different things. And it's just absolutely fascinating when you look at how people dictate their spaces. So what medical doctors expected for a sick room is not necessarily what sick people wanted within their sick room. And so you can see elements of visibility of someone personalizing the space or really making it their own against medical advice. And it's this thing where we think about the voices of disabled people not necessarily being visible, but they are visible, but just sometimes, depending on the resource or the source that you're actually using, it can be from the perspective of someone else, but they're there. If you read between the lines, they are in there. And I do find it really fascinating, but unfortunately, due to COVID, a lot of these sources have been completely invisible to me because the archives have been closed. So that's a separate issue of visibility that I've been dealing with in my research.
Well, this seems kind of a broad topic to explain this wide range concept of disability and turn it into a visibility concept, which I believe from what you're saying is kind of difficult to open eyes to general audience, because there's also these types of urban legends that were circulating around asylums or sanatoriums as well. Have you encountered any sort of urban legend while reading your references?
So not necessarily in a historical context. I mean, obviously there's discussions and assumptions in some of the newspapers at the time. And there's definitely, so for example, when it comes to things like the workhouse, there's people who are for the workhouse and people who are against the workhouse. And some of the media produced against the workhouse is very hard hitting and depicts the workhouse in really horrific ways, using language that if we used today about anything, it would be really problematic. And so they're kind of perpetuating ideas which aren't fundamentally false necessarily about the workhouse, but which do perpetuate these rumors, and it kind of explains why we see stuff that we see today in modern depictions of the workhouse. But the workhouse itself is not a space that you want to end up in. It's designed to be a deterrent, the idea being that you really only go there if you're really desperate to go there. And so there's a lot of depictions of, people being beaten in workhouses or having no beds to sleep in. In fact, there are some workhouses which, so paupers would go into the workhouse, they would be given clothes, and then some people would then leave and try to sell the clothes. So what the workhouse would start doing is they would put their name on the back of it, but also there's accounts of some workhouses discouraging people by writing things like "stop it" on the back of the jackets. And it's really interesting to see how people are sort of like trying to control behavior within these spaces. And like things like that, we don't necessarily see. You don't see someone being given a jacket that says "stop it" in like a modern depiction of the workhouse. And that doesn't become an urban legend. But again, some of these modern ideas about the 19th century, there are nuggets of truth in it. And sometimes they're not too far from the truth. They've just been a bit embellished, and it's worth kind of scratching the surface. Although I do think sometimes our fascination with the workhouse isn't too far out of the fascination with the workhouse that there was in the 19th century. So one of the issues of visibility that I'm doing at the minute is the fact that sometimes people would go into the workhouses to kind of like tour to see the workhouse and to give gifts. So like middle class people would go in to give a gift to the poor people, and it makes them feel better. And there's this idea of mouse and the idea of a gift. So if I was to give you a gift, right, it kind of places you in debt. So the expectation is that you reciprocate and then give me a gift. But if you're a person in a workhouse, you have nothing to give back to this person who has money. And so it places you in the debt. So it creates this hierarchy and reinforces a social hierarchy of you being somehow lesser than or in debt to this person, this middle class person. And it's just really fascinating to sort of see these depictions, because there's one, it's like I think a day out in the workhouse, and in the depiction you see these children, and the way it's done in the picture is the light's coming in from the window, and they're lit up like they're angels with these little cherub faces. And one of the main things about the workhouse and giving gifts is it does reinforce this social hierarchy, the idea of people doing good and maybe being able to turn a blind eye to some of the cruelty of the actual system that was going on and was in place. But again, when it comes to like working class people and the cruelty of the system, people did fight against the workhouse, and they did fight against the new poor law being brought in, and there were people who refused to vote for the new guardians and would spoil their ballots and would write long essays on the back of the ballots basically saying how awful the government was and how they didn't support this and they wouldn't do it to their neighbours. But we don't hear a lot of that. You don't get that in modern depictions of the workhouse. You just see the workhouse. You don't see the forms of everyday resistance that people do. So some people would break windows so that they would go into prison because prison was preferable to the workhouse. Because in the workhouse, you're doing menial labour, very difficult labour, and you're not necessarily doing that in prison, or if you're doing it in prison, it's a lot less difficult than maybe in the workhouse. And so some people did prefer to do that. And then some of the workhouses cottoned on to that. So they'd be all like, you can skip breakfast. We're not actually sending you to prison. And it's really fascinating how people engage in sort of these little bits of resistance. So an example would be you hate your job. So you steal paper clips. So you're sort of like saying, I hate the system, so I'm stealing bits of it back. It's that, but within a workhouse context. And I mean, obviously, there's lots of sort of theoretical bases behind this. And that is one of the things that I probably regret at the start of the PhD is that I am very theory-based. It is a problem. I think it comes from my anthropology background. I love a good theory. And I could write like 30,000 words just introducing heterotopic spaces, but that doesn't really help when I'm trying to talk about something else. So like you have to get through all this quite difficult ideas of what it is. And so, when I do a presentation, I can be a bit more lighthearted about it and go, a heterotopic space is layered, a bit like Shrek saying, this is an onion, just like an onion. Ogres have layers, but I can't write that in my PhD. I can't be all like, please see, figure 1 of Shrek explaining onions as an explanation for heterotopic spaces. It's, it's a different style, but it's one of the things that I really like doing is trying to make the research more accessible, because I think it also makes it more accessible for me because, and I'm guilty of this myself, using 100 words where 10 would suffice. And I think a lot of people in academia are also guilty of this. We do like to write a lot, and we can be sometimes a bit more verbose with the language that we're using, which isn't necessary because it can close doors to make our research not accessible to that wider audience that we want people to read it. We want people to engage with the research. It's fascinating. It's really interesting. And, if they could see our passion about it, they might catch the bug and be all passionate about it as well and want to do their own research.
Well, that's the thing that also from my side, when I writing my thesis, I think it is difficult to escape to the theory because we are so trapped in the many sources that we collect, and we get the conclusion that it is just a theory and there's no practical examples whatsoever. My specialty is kind of different from you because I'm dealing with ancient history and classics. I'm studying cultural interactions and using the concepts hybridity and third space. And while I'm reading third space and hybridity concepts, they just get to the point of the theory and it does not stop. And it's really difficult for me to get into a practical conclusion. And for me, the best is to get examples, better archaeological ones. And I think it's the only way out to show what the people want to read, preferably the scholarship, because we just want palpable facts. And that's the only way, I think, to write a good thesis. And I don't know, as you said, that the theoretical and you have an anthropological background, it is really time-consuming and really difficult to get a practical solution.
Yeah, so I think one of the issues is, like, when I was doing anthropology, we go out and do ethnographic work. I go and talk a lot of the time with people in the present. I go out and sort of engage with people, do participant observation. And with history, I can't really observe them. They're not there. They're in different types of sources, and it's a different way of approaching it. And one of the things that I kind of had a bit of difficulty with when I arrived in the history department was there are terms that I was using that I understood within anthropology, which they have the same meaning as something that has a different historical word for it. So like I would be talking to people and we'd be talking about the exact same thing, but maybe using different words to describe it. And it's one of the things when you're doing interdisciplinary research that sometimes we are on the same page, but we maybe don't realize we're on the same page. And it took a little while to kind of get into the swing of things with history, and because it wasn't something that I was unfamiliar with. It was something I had engaged with prior to this, but it was just that I was engaging with it in a different way. because when I was looking at stuff in my undergraduate and exploring how things became how they were in the present, I was looking at the history of where that came from. So history wasn't far from what I was doing. I just had different ways of going about it, a different way of working. And it took me longer than I care to admit to get into the swing of it, because using those type of sources was very, very different for me. I didn't have a background in using those sources. A lot of the stuff that I was using, I could just kind of search JSTORs for it, or I could find other ways of getting it. It would be online. I didn't have to go into an archive necessarily to access them. So it's a different way of working. It's a different language almost of learning. But it has been really good. And I think if people were doing research, they should really explore the idea of doing interdisciplinary research at some point, just to have a greater appreciation of what other people are doing. So like when I did my master's in public health, and they were all like, are you sure you want to be doing this? Because we don't have any humanities. And I was the only humanities student on the course. I was surrounded by doctors who thought it was a bit strange that I was there. But I got my master's, and I think having me there and having me sort of bring a different perspective to things, I hope will have had a ripple effect going forward into their future practice, because they're maybe going to think about things differently.
I agree with that. I agree all of that. And I think just spreading the message about disability, about the importance of the valid people, not disabled, but valid people, because they are also important and they make also a difference in society. I saw that in your social media that you are an activist for people with disability, and you are also the co-founder and director at Chronically Fabulous. Could you tell us what it consists of, and do you make a connection with your research?
Yeah, so this also probably plays into the idea of visibility. Chronically Fabulous is a project that I started with my friend Debbie Deboo, who was a photographer. And so she has since sort of retired. And so it's me alone running things at the minute. But we provided sort of pamper sessions, makeover days. So you'd come along, get your hair done, makeup done, professional styling, professional photographs, all for free. And the idea being that we give this to a person and we have images of them, of how they want to be seen by the world. And then they write a little bit maybe about organizations that have assisted them or helped them that they want to give a shout out, a little bit of a background about who they are, what conditions they have, things like this, because it was really to challenge the idea of disability. Because when people sometimes think of disability and they think of the imagery of disability, they see someone in a wheelchair. And I think it's only about 8% of the disabled population are wheelchair users. This isn't to say that we shouldn't obviously make everything accessible. So some people have said to me that when you use that statistic, it can then be used by people to go, well, then why bother if it's only 8%? But that's not the point, because it's the idea that we're an umbrella community, and the people who say that about that shouldn't be doing that in regards and I'm not talking about disabled people, I'm talking about the businesses who say this in regards to not making an accessible toilet, because an accessible toilet can be benefit like multiple people. But what we did was we would have the photos and we'd put them up online, and so it really allowed us to challenge perceptions, but at the same time really boost confidence for people. So sometimes people were new to a diagnosis and they would come along, and all of our volunteers have lived experience, and so it was a really positive space, because we didn't shy away from the fact that sometimes things just suck and you have bad days, and it's good to sort of go, this is really awful, the side effects of this, having a difficult day, and maybe I don't feel my best, and I don't know what to do with my hair on those days. So like our hairstylist had experienced cancer, and so was able to sort of discuss what they had done and top tips that they would have had for days when they weren't feeling well and how to manage hair. Our makeup artist would be able to advise if you had shaky hands, what worked for you, what makeup maybe to use if you have sensitive skin, things like this. It was really positive, and unfortunately at the minute we haven't been able to do photographs and things like that with COVID, and also because our main photographer hasn't been well for a while, so we've moved to doing packages in the post. And so we also do this for carers, and basically anyone can be nominated. They just have to contact the page, and then they get something nice in the post. little box with little things just sort of to lighten your day, a little bit of self-care, things like that. And it's just sort of about the idea of spreading positivity, but also, discussing disabled topics in the media and representation and different things like this. And I love what we've done with it. And I have plans for where we're going with it in the future. And it has opened doors for people. So some of the people who got involved with Chronically Fabulous, they went on to become models for underwear companies that specialize in making underwear for people with colostomy bags. And they got sort of national coverage from it. And it really opened doors to having discussions around these topics. And for me, it's just been so important to be able to offer that to people and to have these discussions. Because we're a non-profit, we run off donations. So sometimes things come out of my own pocket. But for me, it's really worthwhile because it has this ripple effect of giving back. So sometimes people are in the hospital and someone's nominated them and they get home and they find this nice parcel just waiting for them. And it lets them know that someone's thinking of them. And it can be just that nice wee pick-me-up. And initially the idea came about because I think my mum said to me, fake it till you make it. So like if you're in the hospital, don't dress like you're in the hospital. Now, some hospitals have engaged in this where the idea is that instead of wearing pajamas, you wear like everyday clothes in the hospital. I don't necessarily recommend that because sometimes you just want to wear your pajamas. It's much more comfortable, especially if you've got chronic pain. But sometimes it can be nice just to do something a bit different, that maybe put in some earrings, put a bit of makeup on while you're in the hospital or something like that, if you feel well enough to do it. It's not to say that everybody has to do it. Everybody's different. But sometimes, like, I felt better in and of myself if maybe I put on something nice when I'm in the hospital, a bit more like I could be seen as a person and not necessarily just a patient in the bed. So, I've had consultants who open the blue curtain and go, oh, it's you again, and close it. And that's the ward round done and dusted. You again. And it's like, you again has a name. You again is a person. You again has a life outside of this space. And so just kind of allowing me to have that little bit of visibility of who I am in that space, for me, was very helpful. And it kind of snowballed into what we ended up doing with Chronically Fabulous. But again, obviously with hospital, it's very individual when people are in. Some people just want to be in their pajamas. I was in hospital earlier this week and I wore pajamas for most of it. It was great. Who doesn't love being in their pajamas all day if you can get away with it? Especially like during COVID, I have mostly lived in my pajamas, even in meetings on Zoom. Not that many people may have noticed, but they'll know now. They'll reflect on it and go, those were pajamas. But that's sort of where it started. And it's been a fascinating journey to where we are now. And I'm currently looking artists to offer, instead of photography, sort of artistic depictions of people who contact us. And that's mostly just so that we can stay COVID safe at the minute, because we do work with a lot of people who would be high risk and vulnerable, myself included. And so I want to ensure that everything we're doing is COVID safe and that we're not putting any risk out there, because for me, it comes down to a moral question. If I was to run an event and someone got sick, I ran the event, so it comes back, the buck stops with me. So working on ways to explore the future of Chronically Fabulous in a hopefully post-COVID world.
You see that Chronically Fabulous has a message to spread the culture of everyone's equal and everyone's welcome, everyone's feel safe and feel integrated by interacting with other people. Is the thing that you have saying minutes ago on your research, giving the example of giving the present and then reciprocating with another present.
Yeah, we're definitely about challenging perceptions, but also, like, I think one of the best things that we've done is really be a confidence boost. So sometimes people come along and they're weighed down by ableist assumptions and things like this. And by the time they leave, they feel really kind of good about themselves because they've had a very positive and affirming experience with other disabled people who can go, yeah, I've lived that. And, this is what I do. This is, what happened. And I think sometimes we can be our own worst enemies, but we can also be really great friends. And, the disabled community like, as I've said, it's a community any person can join at any point in their life because anyone can become disabled. But it's a very welcoming community, and we have a lot of positive people in the community, and people who are happy to like talk about, good and bad days, because it's just like anything. We all have good and bad days, sometimes worse days. And being able to have that space to feel free to talk about it openly. So rather than have someone go, have you tried turmeric? I had a friend and this really helped them. Turmeric was very helpful. You have other disabled people who they really get it. And they're not necessarily saying things that they think are helpful, which are really unhelpful. Like, there was one I saw where someone suggested you cut an onion in half and stick it to your foot, apparently to remove toxins. And I would suddenly apparently not be disabled because I had done that. Whereas, you don't get that when you're talking to other disabled people. They get it. Obviously, there can be internalized ableism that people have. Sometimes we have to unlearn things that we've sort of learned in society. So an example would be, for me, it took me a while to accept that I was disabled. A lot of my disabled friends were using mobility aids and I wasn't at this point. And my health was at a point where I didn't identify with the term. But then I realized that, I had all these ongoing health issues and they were disabling me from living the life that I wanted because there were barriers within society. And when you think about it from the social model perspective, I was disabled. And once I was able to kind of embrace that and go, yeah, you know what, I am disabled. And, society sucks for not actually factoring this in, because we come in all different shapes and sizes as humans, and they should really consider this. And I shouldn't have to be facing different obstacles within trying to get into academia that other people aren't necessarily facing. And these things need changing, and it really kind of helped me sort of to, so to speak, come out as disabled. And then I got very involved in national and regional disability activism and politics, and I was involved in the protests when it came to the rise in tuition fees and equal marriage and abortion access in Northern Ireland and things like this. But the student unions that I've been involved in have been fundamentally very politically active and have had a lot of amazing activists who have really sort of inspired me and helped me get to where I am now. And so now I'm involved in Disabled Students UK, and we do a lot of work in regards to showcasing accessibility within higher education, and have been doing research on the impact of COVID on disabled students. And it's just, it's been really amazing to get to this point where I can have activism that I've seen have real world impact. So an example would be fossil-free QUB. Queen's University ended up divesting from fossil fuel, and I was involved in that as well. And it's just been great to see this real world impact, because I think sometimes we think we're one person and there's nothing we can do. And you can, because if you think of the ripple impact, you can have a huge impact without even knowing it, because you could change the life of someone just by them having met you, because you've inspired them into doing something.
Well, it seems that the activism is quite positive and it continues to grow and grow, but I think it is still a large fight to go on with the disabled people. But also, how many percentage are people with disability studying at university? Do you have any estimative?
So I don't have a percentage of how many disabled people are studying off the top of my head, but I do know that 60% of disabled people who could qualify for disabled students allowance are not applying for it. Sometimes because of internalized ableism, for not necessarily realizing that they are disabled or that it's something that they could access, but also because DSA is such that on some accessibility tools, people are expected to pay out of pocket, say, for the first £200, which not everybody has, which actually creates a barrier for the access to it. And DSA is really helpful for students going to university, because it doesn't remove all barriers, but it does remove some of them. And it's quite alarming that 60% of people who are eligible are not applying. And, it's just the tip of the iceberg. So when we see disability services in universities and students who are using it, we're not seeing the full picture. And also we have a lot of people with invisible or hidden disabilities who maybe aren't realizing that these services are for them, Or there's another one. So I know when I was doing my diagnostic radiography, occupational health, when I was getting assessed, were all like, don't disclose to the university. And I know that when I was putting in my form for UCAS, I was again told by people not to disclose to the university because there was an assumption that there would be discrimination against me. They weren't wrong, unfortunately. That was like how I ended up not managing my first attempt at university. But it is something that many disabled people are facing and worrying, and it is something that people factor in when they're going into a university. How accessible is it? What is the site like? Feedback from other students who have been there. But there's a lot of reasons. And so I have a friend who's doing research on why disabled students drop out of university. And it's absolutely fascinating, some of the initial research that's coming out from their work. But it's reflected in an awful lot of what I hear from other disabled students who are in university and navigating, because as a system, you have to kind of be familiar with it and know where to go. And not everybody knows how to do that. I have learned through trial and error, a lot of trial and error. But when people are arriving at university, sometimes there is this worry that they'll be discriminated against, or there'll be different issues. So like I remember when I'd gone on medical leave, I had a lecturer once have me tell the entire class of second years why I was there, because apparently it would be strange to see a third year in their class. And I had to disclose that I'd been in hospital for a couple of months, and it was none of their business, and I shouldn't have been made to do it. But, you know, they said it was a bit strange to have like a disabled third year there, as if I was some sort of oddity and everybody was staring. And so, you know, for some disabled students, they are navigating a system that has fundamental inherent ableism, unfortunately, built into it. And, you know, when it comes to the actual stats of who is going to university, we do see a lot more disabled people going into university and going into academia, but we do see a lot of people having to drop out and leave because of the hurdles and the barriers that are in place there, which is massively unfortunate because it's 2021 and we should be a lot better than this, but we're not. And Disabled Students UK and other groups are working to challenge this and really raise awareness of it within institutions and encourage that change, but to encourage it from a ground level so that we're actually listening to the students who are being impacted by this day in, day out. So an example would be, I was talking to a friend about when they came to Swansea University, and someone said to them, so they have colour vision deficiency, and someone said to them, oh yeah, just go over there to the green flag. And they're like, I don't know which one is the green flag. And they said what really would have solved this is if they had like a green flag with like the number 1 written on it. So they could go, yeah, go to the green flag with the number 1, because they could see the number 1. But the colour green, you know, it was different for them due to the colour vision deficiency, which more colloquially would be known as being colourblind. But that's a small way in which something was made inaccessible. And again, when people are doing their presentations, sometimes things are inaccessible. So if you have bar charts and maybe they're red and blue, and you think everybody can tell that these are 2 different colours, not everybody can. And obviously with colour vision deficiency, there's a spectrum of it. But there are apps and tools that you can use to sort of put your presentation through to see how it looks for different people, and also factor in like, is the font that I'm using suitable for people who are dyslexic? Is this a fully accessible presentation? And it's surprisingly easy to make your presentation more accessible, and it means then more people can appreciate it, engage with the research. And I think if we really sort of built this into discussions within academia, we could make it way more accessible. Like I look at my A-levels and I think about my maths, and I had a teacher who insisted on using red and green on the board, and I couldn't read it. Couldn't make out what was written on the board, and even when they were told, they kept writing in red and green. And that's such a small change that you can make that makes something accessible for a student. And you know, that doesn't have to be a big song and dance, just use a different marker. But it's small changes that people can do, which has this knock-on impact and really sort of allows disabled students to feel welcome within an institution. And a lot of these things, like, they don't cost money to do. They really don't. Just thinking about what font you use in a PowerPoint, it's not going to cost you anything. It's completely free. So there's no reason not to do it.
I would like to go back into your research, and I was wondering if you have found any accounts of the women's presence in terms of disability in the 19th century.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different depictions of women within the 19th century, and I've done a lot of work in regards to Harriet Martineau. So she's fascinating. She was involved in activism a little bit on women's rights. She herself was deaf, and she had ongoing sort of ovarian issues as well. She wrote Life in the Sick Room, in which she presented the sick room from her perspective and really challenged sort of the medical authority within the space. She also challenged medical authority by choosing to do mesmerism, which is kind of a bit like hypnotism, and claimed that it cured her. But she's a really interesting person who initially, when she was sort of doing her writing, she brought sort of like political economics and things like this to the masses in a much more accessible way. And she also wrote Letter to the Deaf, discussing about her experience as being deaf, but also kind of as a manual for deaf people about how to interact with non-disabled people. So like she's a complicated character because at times she's very forward-thinking, and then at other times you can see that she's kind of within the 19th century and the constraints of the time. So, you know, discussing about how maybe people who are deaf, who like how they should behave around non-disabled people, instead of just sort of discussing about how things could be made accessible, it's kind of changing their behavior. But I mean, there's different ways of approaching her work and discussing it. And then there's also Alice James. So she was in a sick room for a period of time in England. So she was American originally. And she's really interesting because she wrote about her time there and discussing how she found herself really fascinating, and she couldn't really understand how like doctors didn't really see her as this fascinating person with all these ongoing health issues. And she sometimes felt like she once said that she felt that she was not seen as a whole but merely as a stomach or a dislocated elbow. And so we do get these voices of women within the 19th century. But again, both those figures, Alice James and Harriet Martineau, they're white, cisgendered women. And it's sometimes very difficult to ensure that we have diversity within that because they're not working class, they're not people of color, they're not LGBT. And so for me, I really want to have that diversity within my research, but sometimes it's difficult to find. And it's also not been aided by the fact that a lot of archives have been closed during COVID. And so it's one of the limitations, I would say, of my work, and something that I would really like to explore further in the future to ensure that I have this diversity of voices and it's not just disabled voices that are within my research. But we do see these depictions, and one of the issues is that when I'm looking at things like the workhouse and sort of working class representations and depictions of disability, sometimes we're getting these from different voices. So being able to read and write was something that was on the rise. So we do have like poor law letters and things from people, but sometimes people had their neighbours write the letter for them. So it's about them, but someone else is writing. So again, you're reading between the lines. Whereas with Alice and Harriet, you have their own writing. It is their own words. And so it has been a lot easier to go into that source and really find out who they were and explore that. But again, it is a limitation in the fact that sometimes getting these voices has been difficult. So another person would be Isabella Bird, who I explored, and she was a traveler and sort of a travel writer and did an awful lot of amazing things. And sort of she had ongoing back issues, and she felt that when she was traveling, she felt really quite well. And I mean, there are issues in with her because like anthropology has a problematic past in the fact that anthropology has propped up imperialism and colonialism because they had people going out and sending reports back to Britain about, you know, these groups of people and using language that wasn't appropriate. So like it's kind of anthropology's dirty past. And Isabella Bird also has done stuff like that, which isn't necessarily great, but as a person, in regards to being a disabled person, it is there, but it's not necessarily present within the writing. So she she's a disabled person, but she's also the travel writer and she's doing all these things. And for her, she doesn't focus an awful lot on being a disabled person. So you have to read sometimes between the lines to find it. But it is fundamentally a part of who she is because it's one of the main reasons that she kind of began traveling in the first place. But again, middle class, white, cisgendered woman. And so having this diversity has proven a little difficult. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't people there. It's just that I think with more time, I would be able to access that and add that. But COVID has really been quite a limiting factor for me because there were things that I wanted to do that I've not been able to do. And there's archives that I want to use, which I haven't been able to because they've been closed. And some of them have reopened, some of them have not. And it's kind of, left me in this liminal space dealing with things that are literally invisible to me because I can't get into the archive. And it's been a hard space to work in, but it has meant that I've had to kind of work around and find new ways of doing research. But it is very limiting, and it has been very difficult to ensure that the diversity that I want is reflected. So going forward, I want to have more diversity because I'm very conscious of it and I'm very aware of the lack of it sometimes within my writing.
Yeah.
And it's definitely something that I think if you're starting out in your research is to think about how you can decolonize the research and ensure that you have this wider representation within it. Like, what sources are you reading? Have you got female authors, people of color? Whose work are you reading? Ensure that you get a wide range of perspectives because, when I'm looking at heterotopic spaces, sometimes, like, Foucault is a white man. A lot of the authors that I'm reading are historically white men, it's male perspectives. And again, with anthropology, when we look at male anthropologists who went out to do research, they're not able to get into female only spaces. So they're not getting the full picture. Whereas when we have female anthropologists going out, we get a wider picture because maybe the women feel more comfortable speaking to a female anthropologist about different topics. And so it fills in the gaps. And so having this diversity of voices is really important to make sure that you reflect that, but also that you get different perspectives.
Yes, I can see that that's also influencing on my research as going back to the anthropological point of view. It is so influenced on colonialism, even when I'm researching about hybridity and third space, it is still too white ethnicity focused. And on the difference, just to prove something on supremacy, and there's also that example of Isabella Bird, if I'm correct, that has been trying to do the good way in certain to give value on those who were different and from the perspective of the white supremacist ideology, etc. In my research, is also difficult to deal with that, and so. What has been the savior for me is the archaeological facts in that perspective, and I believe that also for your research, you are eventually finding other sources that stay away on those ideologies. Now, as I'm finishing the interview, I would like to know: do you have any final thoughts on doing a PhD degree? What message do you want to transmit to undergraduates and master students who are still undecided to go for a PhD, and the message that you want to send to them for your research? Do you advise them to go for a PhD and doing your specialty, or just in general terms?
So I think disability studies is a growing area and it's fascinating, and there's an awful lot of ways into it from different disciplines. So it's definitely worth exploring. In regards to doing a PhD, I think everybody who thinks it might be something for them should definitely explore the idea of doing it. If you think it's something that you can do, because there's financial elements to it and other factors. But if you think it's something that you would like to do, definitely explore it and put out some feelers and see what's out there. There's also scholarships out there, so keep an eye out for them. There's scholarships available at Swansea University as well. So there's the Swansea University Research Excellence, which is what I'm on. So there are avenues into this area of academia that you may not realise are available, and it is possible to do your PhD part-time as well. But what I would say is try and treat it like a 9 to 5 job. And obviously you can take breaks and things like this. And maybe set like a word limit for what you're going to write in a day. So say 500 words. Don't overdo it. Don't expect 10,000. Set 500. And like, if you don't make 500 in a day, that's not the end of the world. But just try to have that consistent writing throughout, because I have chapters that are 30,000 words and it's too long, but it's better to have more than have less. And so I've done an awful lot of things where I've gone down rabbit holes and researched something that I'm not using at the end of my PhD, but it's still useful and it might be something that I use in the future. So definitely approach it as if it's a 9 to 5 job. And the one thing I would definitely say that most postgraduates don't do is actually get involved with the student union and the university. So I noticed that a lot of postgraduates don't think that societies are for them, that it's only for undergraduates, but they're very welcoming. And you are, as a PhD student, a class of one. Sometimes it's very lonely. So hanging out with other undergraduates and things like this can be great. And it doesn't matter if there's an age gap. There's like a 10-year age gap between me and most other undergraduates, but I'm still hanging out with them. And it's been really good for finding other people who are maybe early in their career and in their research and being able to network with them as well, because some of them are master's students and, you know, we're in similar areas and they might be aware of a conference that's coming up that I can link in with, and networking is also key. And one of the ways I network, which I don't recommend unless you really want to do it, but I swap cat photos sometimes for information about conferences. So it's not unusual to see me falling into bushes on campus chasing a cat to take photographs. It's a very unorthodox way of getting the information, but you know, academia can be an awful lot of fun, and the cat photos are definitely a plus. But key thing, approach it like a job. Try to set like a 500 writing word limit. The words could literally just be notes from stuff that you've read. It doesn't have to be completely, you know, finalized work. Do reference as you go along. Referencing is awful if you have to go back. I spent a couple of days going back and referencing something because I hadn't done it at the time. Big mistake. And networking, definitely network and get involved. Go to conferences, try to write, even if it's just a blog. Try doing podcasts like this. And also consider doing ways of engaging the public with your research. So one of the things that I've done is I've gone to different clubs and societies, so like history groups or even just a local community group who want to have a talk. Sometimes you can come in and present your research to that audience, and it allows you to really bring it to a public space. And I think it also gives you a deeper appreciation of your research, because you have to think about it in a way that makes it available to a wider audience. So you have then a better understanding, because if you can explain, you know, like the idea of explain it to me like I'm 5, if you can explain your research to someone like they're 5, then you're really on the right track in regards to what you're writing.
And also don't forget to, for undergraduates and masters, don't forget to bring your cat or try to find a cat inside the campus.
Oh yeah, cats are everything. Cats are everything.
Cats are everything, indeed. So where students can follow you on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter.
Yeah.
So they can see also a portion of your research if you provide them.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. It's just McKee_Felicity. It's not very exciting. I have meant to change it a couple of times and I just haven't come up with anything catchy. I don't really use Instagram as much. I'm mostly on Twitter. And that would be another thing of advice I would say for anybody who's starting out as well. Twitter's very good for networking within academia. So there's like Twitter Storians or Academic Chatter, PhD Life, PhD Chat. These are all different areas that are good for networking, but also a lot of conferences have hashtags. So if you can't attend or you can't afford to attend, follow the hashtag, get involved with the hashtag, get talking to other researchers, because sometimes someone will be presenting something that is relevant to you. And maybe if you link in with them, they'll give you their reference list and it can be a really good starting point for diving into something. But yeah, you can find me there on Twitter. And I mean, I'm sure if you search for me on Facebook, you'll find me, but mostly I'm on Twitter.
And with that finished the session. So Felicity, thank you very much for being the first interview and for providing a wide range source of your research. And I'm looking for the final product to read in the future. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all so much for hearing the first interview of the PhD Lounge podcast. This interview with Felicity McKee was entertaining and educational for us in terms of explaining her research about disability within a particular period of our history and in the UK in particular. I hope that you have enjoyed hearing this piece of knowledge as I did as well. More interviews with other PhD students researching other topics will appear when the time comes. And your support is paramount to outreach other PhD students and curious listeners, and also helping the podcast algorithm to put PhD Lounge at the top. Consider leaving a review on your preferred podcast platforms where you are tuning in this session: Spotify, Stitcher, Anchor FM, or Google Podcasts, as well as sharing it through your socials and with your friends. You can also follow my socials: Facebook at PhD Pod Lounge, Instagram at PhD LMF, and Twitter at PhD Loungecast, and my website where you can also check my email, phdlounge-podcast.com, and luisphdlounge@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening. It has been a pleasure.